The Senate chamber hummed with the usual partisan energy as the afternoon session on government reform legislation continued. Senator Mitt Romney, the former Republican presidential nominee known for his principled independence, listened attentively as Representative Jasmine Crockett presented her Government Accountability Enhancement Act before the Joint Committee. Crockett had just finished outlining the final provisions of her proposal, a comprehensive plan to increase transparency in federal contracting while reducing administrative burdens across agencies. Her presentation had been methodical, substantive, and notably free of the partisan rhetoric that typically characterized such sessions. As the committee chair prepared to recognize the next speaker, Senator Romney unexpectedly raised his hand, requesting additional time. A momentary hush fell over the chamber. "Representative Crockett," Romney began, his voice measured and clear. "I've studied your proposal extensively, and while we come from different political traditions, I must acknowledge that your accountability framework represents the most thoughtful approach to government efficiency I've encountered in my years of public service." He paused briefly, his expression resolute. "Today, I'm announcing my support for the core provisions of this legislation. Good governance isn't a partisan issue. It's about creating systems that serve American citizens effectively regardless of which party holds power." The chamber fell silent as the significance of this moment registered. A senior Republican senator with unimpeachable conservative credentials had just publicly endorsed legislation authored by a progressive Democratic representative. Then, gradually, something remarkable happened. Members from both sides of the aisle began to applaud, a spontaneous recognition that transcended the usual partisan divisions. What unfolded in the next few minutes wasn't just an unexpected political alliance. It was a powerful reminder that principled leadership could still bridge America's deepest divisions. If you appreciate moments when our elected officials rise above partisan division to focus on practical solutions, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more content that highlights unity over division in American politics. To understand the significance of Senator Romney's support for Representative Crockett's government reform legislation, we must examine the backgrounds of these two public servants and the deeply polarized political landscape they navigated. Mitt Romney had built his reputation through decades of leadership in both business and government. After founding Bain Capital and turning around the Salt Lake City Olympics, he served as governor of Massachusetts before his 2012 presidential nomination. Throughout his career, Romney had emphasized data-driven decision-making and efficient organizational systems. What distinguished Senator Romney from many of his colleagues, noted political analyst Dr. Rebecca Chen, was his consistent focus on effective governance rather than ideological purity. His business background gave him a unique perspective on organizational efficiency that transcended partisan divisions. As a senator, Romney had occasionally broken with party orthodoxy when he believed principles required it, earning respect for his independence even from those who disagreed with his positions. His approach to legislation was characteristically methodical, focusing on specific provisions and measurable outcomes rather than political messaging. Representative Jasmine Crockett had followed a different path to public service. After establishing herself as a civil rights attorney handling complex cases, she entered politics with a focus on systemic reform and institutional accountability. Her legal background had honed both her analytical skills and her ability to build coalitions around specific objectives. "What made Representative Crockett effective as a legislator," explained government efficiency expert Thomas Richardson, "was her emphasis on measurable improvements to government operations rather than purely symbolic victories. She approached reform with a prosecutor's attention to detail and a pragmatist's focus on achievable results." Since entering Congress, Crockett had surprised colleagues by focusing significant attention on government efficiency initiatives that received little public attention but affected millions of Americans through improved service delivery. She had gained notice for working across partisan lines to identify specific bureaucratic processes that created unnecessary burdens for citizens regardless of political affiliation. The political environment surrounding them had grown increasingly divisive. After contentious election cycles, partisan identity had hardened to the point that many lawmakers reflexively opposed any proposal from the opposing party regardless of its substance. Media coverage reinforced these divisions, often focusing on conflict rather than areas of potential agreement. Against this backdrop, Crockett had spent months developing the Government Accountability Enhancement Act, a comprehensive reform package addressing inefficiencies in federal contracting, grant management, and regulatory compliance. Rather than approaching it as a partisan initiative, she had consulted with government efficiency experts from administrations of both parties and incorporated successful practices from diverse states. What made Crockett's approach unique, explained former Office of Management and Budget Director James Wilson, was that it wasn't driven by ideology but by a genuine commitment to making government work better for citizens. She gathered perspectives from Republican and Democratic administrations, from rural and urban communities, from business leaders and public sector employees. The legislation contained three core elements: standardized digital reporting requirements that would reduce paperwork burdens across agencies, transparent tracking systems for federal contracts to prevent waste and duplication, and streamlined approval processes that maintained oversight while reducing delays. These weren't partisan proposals at their core. They addressed administrative inefficiencies that frustrated Americans regardless of political affiliation. The challenge was overcoming the reflexive opposition that had become the default response to any cross-party initiative. What other examples of bipartisan cooperation on practical governance issues have you observed? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your perspectives help us identify more stories of constructive leadership worth highlighting. The Joint Committee hearing on government reform had been scheduled as part of a broader congressional initiative to address declining public trust in government institutions. Representatives from both chambers had gathered to consider various proposals, with the Government Accountability Enhancement Act as the most comprehensive package under consideration. The hearing room in the Dirksen Senate Office Building was filled to capacity, with efficiency experts, agency representatives, and policy analysts joining the usual contingent of staffers and journalists. The atmosphere carried the familiar tension of partisan division, with members largely clustered with their respective party colleagues. As the session began, several predictable patterns emerged. Republican members emphasized reducing regulatory burdens and cutting costs, while Democratic members focused on strengthening oversight and expanding services. The questions directed at witnesses frequently seemed designed to reinforce existing positions rather than explore potential common ground. This pattern continued until Representative Crockett was recognized to present her legislation. Instead of beginning with broad principles or partisan framing, she took a distinctly different approach. This committee is considering how we might restore Americans' trust in government institutions, Crockett began. I'd suggest we start by acknowledging a reality that affects citizens across the political spectrum. Interacting with federal agencies is often unnecessarily complicated, time-consuming, and frustrating. She activated a presentation showing the current process for small businesses applying for federal contracts, with its multiple duplicative forms, inconsistent requirements across agencies, and lengthy approval timelines. A small business owner in rural Texas faces the same bureaucratic maze as one in downtown Chicago, Crockett continued. The frustration when dealing with government inefficiency isn't liberal or conservative, it's universal. Senator James Wilson, known for his conservative credentials, shifted forward slightly, his interest visibly piqued by this practical framing. Crockett then methodically outlined the specific inefficiencies her legislation addressed, using concrete examples rather than abstract principles. She displayed data showing how standardized digital reporting requirements had reduced paperwork burdens by 47% when implemented in pilot programs across agencies. These aren't theoretical improvements, she emphasized. They've been tested in diverse contexts and demonstrated measurable results for both citizens and agencies. As Crockett continued her presentation, she directly addressed potential concerns from both progressive and conservative perspectives, demonstrating how the legislation incorporated safeguards important to different constituencies. The transparency provisions maintain robust oversight to prevent waste and abuse, she noted, acknowledging progressive priorities, while the streamlined approval processes reduce unnecessary regulatory burdens that frustrate citizens and businesses, addressing conservative concerns. Senator Romney, who had been listening intently, posed the first substantive question. Representative Crockett, while I appreciate the efficiency goals, how does your legislation ensure accountability isn't sacrificed for speed? In my business experience, finding that balance was always the central challenge. It was the kind of probing but non-adversarial question that had become increasingly rare in congressional hearings. Rather than seeing it as an attack, Crockett recognized it as a legitimate concern worthy of serious response. "Senator Romney, that balance is precisely what guided our approach," she replied. "Let me show you how the contract transparency system creates real-time visibility without adding administrative burdens." She displayed the digital dashboard that would track contract timelines, completion rates, and budget adherence, making performance issues immediately visible to oversight committees and agency leaders. This system doesn't just identify problems after the fact. It creates early warning indicators so issues can be addressed before they become failures, Crockett explained. The data shows that similar systems in the private sector and in some state governments have actually strengthened accountability while reducing administrative overhead. Romney nodded thoughtfully, making notes as Crockett illustrated how the system had worked in specific contexts. As the hearing continued, an unusual dynamic emerged. Rather than falling into predictable partisan patterns, members began asking substantive questions about implementation details, transition costs, and specific efficiency metrics. The discussion had shifted from ideological positioning to practical governance. When Senator Elizabeth Martinez, known for her progressive advocacy, raised concerns about whether streamlined processes might weaken environmental protections, Crockett responded with the same substantive engagement she had shown to Romney's questions. "Senator Martinez, that concern shaped our approach to regulatory streamlining," Crockett acknowledged. "The legislation maintains all substantive environmental requirements while eliminating duplicative paperwork and contradictory filing deadlines that create unnecessary barriers to compliance." She displayed data from EPA pilot programs showing how simplified reporting requirements had actually improved compliance rates among small businesses while allowing agency staff to focus on substantive review rather than paperwork management. As questions continued from both sides of the aisle, a pattern became evident. Crockett had anticipated legitimate concerns from diverse perspectives and incorporated solutions that addressed them. Rather than dismissing opposing viewpoints, she had engaged with them substantively during the legislation's development. Halfway through the hearing, Senator Jason Williams, known for his partisan rhetoric, attempted to steer the discussion back to familiar political territory. "Representative Crockett, isn't this just another Democratic attempt to expand government control under the guise of reform?" he challenged. Before Crockett could respond, Senator Romney unexpectedly intervened. "If I might address that characterization," Romney began, "having reviewed this legislation thoroughly, I see nothing that expands government authority. What it does is make existing functions more efficient and transparent, goals I believe we all share regardless of party." The room quieted as Romney continued. "My business career taught me to evaluate proposals based on their specific provisions rather than partisan labels. When I look at the actual mechanisms in this legislation, standardized digital reporting, transparent contract tracking, streamlined approvals with maintained oversight, I see practical improvements that would benefit citizens while potentially reducing costs." It was a remarkable moment. A senior Republican senator defending legislation authored by a progressive Democrat based not on political calculation but on substantive merit. As the hearing continued, Romney asked several detailed questions that reflected his business experience, about implementation timelines, training requirements for agency staff, and compatibility with existing systems. Each question was substantive rather than political, focused on how the reforms would function in practice. Crockett responded with equal substance, demonstrating detailed knowledge of operational challenges and how the legislation addressed them. She acknowledged limitations and implementation challenges honestly, showing a pragmatism that resonated with Romney's own approach to problem-solving. By the time Crockett concluded her testimony, the tenor of the hearing had transformed. What began as a typical partisan exercise had evolved into something approaching genuine deliberation about practical governance improvements. As the chairman prepared to call the next witness, Romney requested a final moment. "Representative Crockett, I've reviewed dozens of government reform proposals during my public service," he began. "What distinguishes your legislation is its focus on specific operational improvements rather than abstract principles. The provisions addressing contract transparency and standardized reporting requirements are particularly well designed based on my experience with organizational systems." He paused briefly, seeming to consider his next words carefully. While we may approach many policy questions from different perspectives, effective government administration serves citizens across the political spectrum. I look forward to working with you to refine these proposals as they move forward. It wasn't yet a full endorsement, but the signal was clear to everyone in the room. Romney was evaluating the legislation on its merits rather than its partisan origin. The foundation for an unexpected alliance had been established, setting the stage for the remarkable moment that would soon follow. The weeks following the joint committee hearing saw an unusual level of substantive engagement with the Government Accountability Enhancement Act. Rather than immediate dismissal along partisan lines, the legislation had earned serious consideration from lawmakers across the political spectrum. Senator Romney had assembled a small working group to analyze the bill's provisions in detail, bringing together efficiency experts from both Republican and Democratic administrations to evaluate potential impacts. Representative Crockett had participated in these sessions, responding to technical questions and considering suggested refinements with an open mind. What distinguished these working sessions, noted former OMB official Thomas Richardson, who participated in several meetings, was their focus on practical governance rather than political positioning. The discussions centered on implementation details, transition challenges, and measurement metrics, the kind of substantive policy work that rarely makes headlines but ultimately determines whether reforms succeed. Romney had been particularly engaged with provisions related to contract transparency and reporting standardization, drawing on his business experience to suggest refinements that would strengthen accountability while further reducing administrative burdens. Senator Romney approached the legislation like a management consultant rather than a politician, observed one staff member present for the sessions. His questions and suggestions focused on operational effectiveness rather than political implications. For her part, Crockett had demonstrated remarkable receptivity to substantive improvements regardless of their source. When Romney suggested modifications to the digital reporting requirements based on lessons from private sector implementations, she incorporated these changes without concern for who would receive credit. Representative Crockett's approach was refreshingly pragmatic, noted a senior Republican staff member who had initially been skeptical. She seemed genuinely interested in creating effective systems rather than claiming political victories. As the legislation moved toward a committee vote, Romney invited Crockett to his office for a final review of the modified provisions. Their meeting, scheduled for 30 minutes, extended to nearly 2 hours as they discussed implementation details and potential refinements. When they emerged, staff members noted something unusual. Both lawmakers appeared energized rather than exhausted by their extended policy discussion. The substantive engagement with complex governance questions had apparently been intellectually stimulating for both, despite their different political backgrounds. The day of the committee vote arrived with the Capitol buzzing with unusual speculation. Reports had circulated that Romney might break with partisan expectations, but few anticipated what actually occurred as the session began. As members settled into their seats, Romney requested recognition before the formal presentation of the legislation. The committee chair, somewhat surprised, yielded the floor. "Before we proceed with today's vote," Romney began, "I want to share some perspective on the Government Accountability Enhancement Act based on my extensive review over the past several weeks." The room quieted as Romney continued, his manner thoughtful and deliberate. "Throughout my business career, I evaluated proposals based on their specific merits rather than their source. I've approached this legislation with the same principle, analyzing its provisions for their potential to improve government operations rather than considering political implications." He glanced briefly at his notes before continuing. "The revised legislation before us today includes several significant improvements to government operations. Standardized digital reporting requirements that would reduce paperwork burdens by an estimated 42% across agencies, transparent tracking systems for federal contracts that would prevent millions in waste and duplication, and streamlined approval processes that maintain oversight while reducing delays that frustrate citizens and businesses alike." Romney looked up, making eye contact with colleagues on both sides of the aisle. "These aren't partisan measures. They're practical improvements to government functions that affect Americans regardless of political affiliation. The small business owner attempting to navigate federal contracting requirements, the grant recipient dealing with inconsistent reporting formats, the citizen waiting for permit approvals, all would benefit from these reforms." He turned slightly toward Crockett, who was seated across the chamber. "Representative Crockett, I've studied your proposal extensively, and while we come from different political traditions, I must acknowledge that your accountability framework represents the most thoughtful approach to government. Efficiency I've encountered in my years of public service." A murmur of surprise moved through the committee room as Romney continued. "Today, I'm announcing my support for the core provisions of this legislation. Good governance isn't a partisan issue. It's about creating systems that serve American citizens effectively regardless of which party holds power." The chamber fell silent as committee members processed this unexpected endorsement. Romney's reputation for careful deliberation and principled independence gave his support particular weight, transcending typical partisan calculations. After a moment of profound silence, something remarkable happened. Senator James Wilson, a conservative who rarely found common ground with Democratic initiatives, spoke up. "Senator Romney's assessment carries significant weight given his organizational expertise," Wilson noted. "While I had initial reservations, the revised provisions addressing regulatory streamlining merit serious consideration regardless of partisan labels." From the Democratic side, Senator Martinez acknowledged the substantive improvements that had resulted from Romney's input. "The strengthened accountability provisions Senator Romney helped develop actually improve the legislation's alignment with our oversight priorities," she observed. "This is what constructive policymaking should look like." As comments continued from both sides of the aisle, a striking pattern emerged. Members were discussing the specific provisions of the legislation rather than its partisan implications. The conversation had shifted from political positioning to practical governance in ways rarely seen in contemporary congressional proceedings. When the chairman finally called for a vote, the legislation passed committee with an unexpectedly strong bipartisan majority. 7 Republican senators, following Romney's lead, joined all committee Democrats in supporting the measure, a result that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. As members gathered their materials after the vote, cameras captured Romney and Crockett engaged in conversation, comparing notes on implementation priorities and transition planning. The image of a former Republican presidential nominee and a progressive Democratic representative collaborating substantively on government reform provided a powerful visual counterpoint to the partisan division that dominated most political coverage. "I've covered Congress for 25 years, remarked veteran journalist Sarah Johnson to a colleague, and these moments have become increasingly rare, when the substance of governance temporarily transcends the imperatives of partisan positioning." The committee vote represented just the first step in a complex legislative process, but something important had changed. Romney's willingness to evaluate the legislation on its merits rather than its partisan origin had created space for other members to do the same, shifting the conversation from political calculation to practical governance in ways that would shape the bill's ultimate prospects. As Romney and Crockett left the committee room together, continuing their discussion of implementation details, they provided a visible reminder that effective governance required more than partisan loyalty. It demanded substantive engagement with practical challenges that affected citizens across political divisions. In the weeks following the committee vote, the political implications of Romney and Crockett's unexpected alliance reverberated through Washington and beyond. Media coverage, initially focused on the political surprise of a conservative senator supporting progressive legislation, gradually shifted to examining the substantive reforms the bill proposed. Romney-Crockett government reform bill advances, what it means for federal efficiency, read the headline in the Washington Post, signaling a focus on governance rather than just political positioning. The article detailed specific provisions that would affect citizens' interactions with government agencies, from streamlined permit processes to simplified grant applications for community organizations. Business publications highlighted the potential economic benefits of reduced administrative burdens. Federal contracting reforms could save small businesses millions in compliance costs, noted the Wall Street Journal, quoting efficiency experts from both Democratic and Republican administrations who supported the bill's approach to standardization. As the legislation moved to the Senate floor, Romney's influence proved significant in expanding support beyond the initial committee vote. Several Republican senators who had previously dismissed government reform as a partisan issue began engaging with the specific provisions, particularly those addressing regulatory streamlining and cost reduction. Senator Romney's endorsement created space for substantive engagement rather than reflexive opposition, explained political analyst Dr. Michael Chan. His reputation for careful analysis and business expertise gave cover to colleagues who might otherwise have feared political consequences for supporting democratic legislation. For her part, Crockett demonstrated remarkable political skill in maintaining progressive support while accommodating legitimate conservative concerns. When questioned about her willingness to work with Romney, her response emphasized practical results over partisan purity. Effective governance isn't about scoring political points, it's about creating systems that actually work for citizens, she explained during a press conference. Senator Romney brought valuable expertise to this process, and the legislation is stronger for incorporating perspectives from different traditions. The bill's journey through the Senate revealed something significant about American governance that had been obscured by years of partisan conflict. When legislation addressed practical problems with technically sound solutions, bipartisan cooperation remained possible. 3 months after the initial committee hearing, the Government Accountability Enhancement Act passed the Senate with support from 16 Republican senators joining all 50 Democrats. The margin reflected both Romney's influence and the substantive appeal of reforms that promised tangible improvements to government operations regardless of which party held power. The House passage followed a similar pattern, with 32 Republicans crossing party lines to support the legislation. President Martin signed the bill into law at a ceremony that deliberately highlighted its bipartisan development, with both Romney and Crockett given prominent roles in recognition of their unusual partnership. This legislation demonstrates what's possible when public servants focus on practical governance rather than partisan advantage, the president noted. Senator Romney and Representative Crockett have shown that improving government operations need not be a partisan battleground. Implementation began with pilot programs in 3 federal agencies, allowing for refinement before government-wide adoption. Early results confirmed many of the efficiency gains projected during legislative development. The standardized reporting system reduced paperwork burdens for grant recipients by 51% in initial deployments, reported the Government Accountability Office in its 6-month assessment. Agency staff previously dedicated to processing redundant forms have been redirected to substantive program evaluation, improving both efficiency and effectiveness. Small business owners participating in federal contracting pilots reported similar improvements. I spent 40% less time on paperwork and had much clearer visibility into where my application stood in the process, noted James Richardson, who owned a technology services firm in Michigan. The new system felt like it was designed to facilitate legitimate business rather than create obstacles. The legislation's long-term impact extended beyond specific operational improvements. The Romney-Crockett partnership became a case study in effective governance, cited by political scientists and public administration experts as a model for bridging partisan divides through substantive engagement. Harvard's Kennedy School of Government developed a teaching module around the legislation's development, using it to illustrate how policy entrepreneurs could create space for bipartisan cooperation even in polarized environments. The case study emphasized how focusing on concrete operational improvements rather than ideological framing had enabled progress where previous reform efforts had failed. What distinguished the Romney-Crockett approach, noted Professor Elena Rodriguez, who developed the curriculum, was its emphasis on specific administrative mechanisms rather than abstract principles. By focusing on how government actually functions at an operational level, they identified improvements that transcended typical partisan divisions. The partnership influenced other legislators as well. A bipartisan working group on regulatory modernization explicitly adopted what they called the Romney-Crockett model, beginning with operational analysis rather than ideological positioning, and evaluating proposals based on their specific mechanisms rather than partisan origin. Senator James Wilson, who had initially approached the legislation with skepticism, became an unexpected advocate for this approach. My experience with the Government Accountability Act changed how I evaluate policy proposals, he acknowledged during a symposium on effective governance. I've learned to look beyond partisan labels to analyze specific provisions and their practical effects on citizens and businesses. The media narrative gradually shifted as well. Stories highlighting the legislation's substantive impacts began appearing alongside continuing coverage of partisan conflicts. While political division remained the dominant theme in Washington coverage, The Romney-Crockett model offered an alternative narrative about governance that resonated with audiences frustrated by constant partisan positioning. Americans consistently tell us they want government that functions effectively regardless of which party controls Washington, noted media analyst Sarah Johnson. The Romney-Crockett story offers a rare example of that principle actually operating in practice, rather than just campaign rhetoric. 2 years after implementation, comprehensive assessment confirmed the legislation's effectiveness. Administrative costs had decreased by an estimated $1.4 billion annually, while measures of citizen and business satisfaction with government interactions showed significant improvement across agencies. The standardized digital systems have reduced processing times by an average of 37% while improving accuracy and transparency, reported the Office of Management and Budget in its biennial assessment. These improvements benefit citizens across regional, demographic, and political divisions. At a conference marking the 2-year implementation milestone, both Romney and Crockett reflected on their unexpected partnership. "What I've learned through this process," Romney observed, "is that effective governance requires looking beyond partisan identity to evaluate ideas based on their specific merits. When we focus on how government actually functions at an operational level, we often find common ground that transcends typical political divisions." Crockett nodded in agreement. This legislation succeeded because we approached government reform as a practical challenge rather than an ideological battleground. By focusing on specific mechanisms that affect citizens' actual experiences with government, we created space for collaboration that might otherwise have seemed impossible. As they concluded their remarks, Romney shared something he had never publicly revealed before. "When I first received Representative Crockett's draft legislation, I approached it with professional skepticism. Not because of its source, but because most reform proposals fail to appreciate the operational complexities of large organizations. What convinced me was the evident care taken to understand those complexities. The legislation reflected countless hours of analyzing how government functions actually work and how they might work better." He continued, looking directly at Crockett. "That approach represents the highest tradition of public service, placing effectiveness above ideology and listening above asserting. It's an approach I believe our founders envisioned and that we would do well to embrace more broadly." The sustained applause that followed wasn't just for the successful legislation, but for a model of governance that transcended the partisan divisions that had come to dominate American public life. As the conference concluded, a simple plaque was unveiled commemorating the legislation's impact. It bore a quote that captured the spirit of the unlikely partnership that had made it possible. "Good governance isn't about partisan victory, but about creating systems that serve citizens effectively regardless of which party holds power." The story of Senator Romney's support for Representative Crockett's government reform initiative offers a powerful reminder that even in divided times, substantive engagement with practical governance challenges can build bridges across political differences. Their example demonstrated that effective public service isn't about partisan positioning, but about the harder work of creating systems that actually improve citizens' interactions with government. If you found value in this story of practical cooperation across partisan lines, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. In a media landscape often dominated by conflict, we remain committed to highlighting moments when elected officials find ways to work together toward shared goals despite different perspectives. America's governance challenges remain complex, and perspectives on solutions will continue to differ significantly. But the Romney-Crockett partnership reminds us that addressing these challenges effectively requires not just advocacy for particular positions, but the willingness to evaluate ideas based on their specific merits rather than their partisan origin.